Hi everyone, Ken Woods here from Colorado Mahler Fest. Welcome back. I'm going to talk a little bit today about conducting the music of Gustav Mahler. This is a question I get asked a lot. What is it like to conduct Mahler's music? And the answer is it's great. It's really great. It's like the most fun thing ever. And that's the end of the video. No, that's not the end of the video. Along these lines, I think what people are really asking is what are the challenges of conducting this music? There's all sorts of challenges of endurance, challenges of characterization, challenges of decision making, of persuasion. I want to just actually talk about some technical challenges for the conductor, things that are actually demand a little bit of thought about how to guide the musicians through. So I'm going to just take the openings of each of the 5 movements of this symphony and talk about the challenges of the first few bars of each movement. Now, the 5th Symphony begins with the solo trumpet playing this famous fanfare, and it's one possibility for sure for the conductor not to conduct at all in this opening. Personally, I've never been able to reconcile myself to that as a legitimate decision. This is not a cadenza, it's not a solo showcase for the trumpet, although there are trumpet players who might disagree with me, I don't know. This is an integral part of the symphony as a whole, and actually it contains in it the melodic cells, the motivic cells of almost everything that is to follow. So the symphony begins with this solo. The interpretation of the symphony begins with this solo. So I think the conductor has a role to play in making sure that the symphony starts in a way that is sympathetic to their view of the entire work ahead. Now, I suppose it's also possible to have worked out in advance with your trumpet player what you want them to do. I've never known many trumpet players who wanted lots of advice from a conductor about how to play this solo in the week of a concert. So we try to avoid that and not burden them with extra conversation and suggestion. But yes, you could just say, I want it this fast, and is that okay? And can you phrase to here, whatever. On the other hand, you don't want to conduct in a way that's going to make an already under pressure musician feel additionally pressurized. So my goal in this opening is to find a way to establish the parameters of this opening while giving the trumpet player as much freedom and flexibility as I feel that I can. And so this is a mixture of marking and conducting. By marking, we mean this sort of passive beating as if you would use when marking rests in a concerto, Just we're going through here, 1 bar, 2 bars, 3 bars. There's very little precision of rhythmic impulse in there that would make anyone play or move or think they have to do anything. But it is keeping track of how long each of these bars last. So the trumpet player, of course, starts with this triplet pickup, which we know is stylized, so it's to be played faster than notated. So if I divide each bar into 4 parts, da-ka-da-da, da-ka-da-da, that's what it looks like on the page, but Mahler says that the triplet should be stylized and played faster than printed, quasi accelerando, so getting faster. So da-ka-da-dum, da-ka-da-dum. Now, some trumpet players play this as if it's in 6/4, so instead of 4 beats per bar, we go 1, 2, 3, dun, da-ka-da-dum, da-ka-da-dum. That's stylized, but it doesn't have that sense of a accelerando. So actually, I think that where the trumpet player can use my help is giving them an upbeat that has enough energy in it that creates the space for that triplet to sort of hang in the air before being played. But what I don't want to do is force them to arrive on the main note before they're ready. So I want them to play it as fast as they comfortably can, but especially as you get into the da-ga-da-dee, the 3rd bar, if I give them a really sharp downbeat, then I'm getting in their way a little bit, and if they're nervous, they're much more likely to split it. So rather than beating equally clearly, I will give a passive preparation so that they know to get started, a somewhat more active upbeat, and then a passive arrival. So prepare, but notice when I come down, I'm trying to stay out of their way. They can place those triplets and the downbeat wherever they want, and I'm actually following them at that point. And that allows us to come to a shared view without a lot of discussion and debate. It allows me to make sure that the opening atmosphere and tempo is one that I think is right for the piece, but still give the trumpet player in the moment the freedom to do what he or she needs to do to feel confident in that opening passage under pressure. So the beginning of the second movement is really treacherous, especially to get what Mahler asks for, which is starting stormy and fast in the cellos, basses, and bassoons, immediately a rit in the second half of the first bar, then a tempo in the second bar, another rit in the third bar, and then a tempo at the end of that bar. This means we have to find a way to sort of bend time a little bit. So if we think da-da-dee-da-dum, there's a rit, then a chord on the downbeat of the bar, da-da-dee-da-da is another rit, and now there's a chord on the fourth beat of the bar, and that is tricky business. So a general rule for conductors is that once you stop, you have to start again. Now that sounds really obvious, but what it means is if the motion of your hand stops in space, then you can't really get the orchestra started again without preparing them. Yeah? So, for instance, I can go 1, 2, ba-da-dee-da-dum. I can stop and prepare that chord on the next bar. That's fine. Yeah? Ska-da-dee-da-dum. Bump. Fine. But it's not possible to do that in the third bar because it's da-da-dee-da-da, 2, ba, ba. Yeah? So there's no space in which to prepare that. So the balancing comment is if you don't stop, you don't have to prepare the beat. So I can show that time has stopped, but keep my hands moving. And in doing so, then I don't have to give a preparation. I'm not sure why this works. No one knows. It's like a Schrodinger's cat kind of thing. But if you keep your hand going while the music is paused, you can avoid the preparation. So from the beginning, 1, 2, ba-da-dee-da-dum, bump, ba-da-dee-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-da-da, and then it's fine, yeah? But it's really important that you keep going, ba-da-da-da-da-da, and then without giving any preparation, somehow the musicians know to re-enter in time. All right, so now we come to the third movement. The great thing about this piece is it just keeps getting more and more difficult. So the beginning of the third movement, couple things to think about. First of all, many performances of this symphony falter at this point for two reasons. One, it's bloody difficult, the third movement. It's so hard. And two, the musicians are so physically and emotionally drained after the first two movements that they don't have the chops, the concentration, the energy, and the focus for this much more sort of modernistic, much more intricate middle movement. So the first thing to keep in mind is to take your time between the second and third movements, between part 1 and part 3 of the symphony. As with the second movement, this movement opens with a barrage of tempo instructions. So over the first bar, he writes in German, strongly, vigorously, not too fast. Yeah. Then in the second bar, a cello rondo, that is getting faster. Yeah. In the third bar, poco rit. In the fourth bar, a tempo. And in the fifth bar, nicht eilen, not hurried. So every bar, there's some kind of a tempo indication. How do we control this, and how do we make sense of it just in a purely coordination manner? The first bar is 4 horns, not including the principal, who joins in the third bar. And this theme, which again, strongly, vigorously, not too fast, is going to appear many more times in the movement, often preceded by faster music. This is definitely being pulled out of the world of folk music, in particular the Ländler, which is a sort of rustic, folky dance in 3/4 time. So it's not a waltz. It shouldn't swing like a waltz. It needs to have a little bit more resistance in the tempo. And in fact, Bruno Walter reported that this whole movement was based on a poem by Goethe, the opening line of which was, "Hurry on time at a rattling trot." So this opening is this impatience, time's moving too slowly. Yeah, so for the conductor to simply yapapam, patatati, which you hear a lot, to me, that's ignoring the not too fast aspect of it and the flexibility required. So how do you get those first 3 notes together in the horns? And how do you get that gesture together on subsequent appearances? A little bit of rehearsal is a good idea, but using horizontal space here is particularly useful. So whatever I do before, I want to go up, up, bomb, and as long as I'm going that way, they can't get to the third note. It gives me more control. So if I try to go yup, up, bomb, I'm largely at their mercy to time it. Yeah, but yup, up, bomb, bop, 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 beam. I have almost complete control as long as they're looking at me. And it comes down to using that controlled horizontal motion to the second beat of the bar. Now, second bar of the piece, forgive me, is in a cello rondo. So that again is tricky. There's not a lot of time to do in a cello rondo. Yup, up, 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 beam. So one thing you can do as a conductor is understand that the audience doesn't really need to know where you're starting the cello rondo as long as the relative durations of the notes they're hearing make sense. So for me, it's yup, up, bum. I take as long as I think I need, and then I start the cello rondo a little bit before it's printed. So yup, up, bum, bop, 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 bee. So I'm not waiting until that silent downbeat to begin to move them forwards and then hoping they're going to get to the second beat with me. I'm already showing before the rest. Yup, up, bum, bop, 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 bee. And that allows me to have, again, quite a lot of clarity and control with the musicians. The poco rit is another challenge. So yup, up, bum, bop, 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 bee. Now, then a tempo, this takes us back to the issue of the previous movement. How to show a new tempo when you don't want to give a full preparation. So there's 2 possible solutions here. One is to treat it as a rit and just drop the tempo out of space. beep, ba, 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 and that will work fine. Or you can treat the writ as a fermata. Yum, rum, bum, ba, bim, bum. And the decision of which of those to do will depend a little bit on how confident your group is, how responsive your horn player is. So with maybe more rehearsal time and a more dialed in sense of telepathy between you and the musicians, you don't need to prepare the a tempo. But in another situation, you may want to. And there's something to be said for preparing the a tempo in that it gives the horn player a clearer sense of how much time he or she has to breathe after their long notes. So be ba ba bim ba. Again, if I'm just doing that, I could actually take all day, and they don't necessarily know what the speed's going to be when they come off of that long B. So that's the beginning of the third movement. A lot of treacherous moments in those first few seconds. So now we come to the Adagietto, one of the most beautiful movements in all of symphonic music. Also one of the most hotly debated. And so as a conductor, I think you have to be prepared to absorb all of the history of debate about how fast or slow this movement should be played and come to your own view that you really believe in, rather than feeling that you're trying to please a particular constituency. And the opening of this movement is as challenging as anything else in the piece. So the opening of the Adagietto, and I alluded to this, and depending how much of a Mahler geek you are, well, I mean, if you're watching this video, you're probably a Mahler geek, but depending on how much of a Mahler geek you are, you may or may not be aware that there's all sorts of very impassioned debate about how long this movement should take and how fast it should go. Now, the first thing I should say is that those two things don't necessarily go together. And for me, that's very key, that we sort of know about how long Mahler's performances were, and they varied quite a bit. But also his instructions to the conductor vary quite a bit. So for instance, at the very end of the piece, he originally said for the conductor to play it very, very held back. And then he changed his mind and said, no, it should be really driving forwards. And then at the last performance, he went back to the original idea of very held back. And that one change alone can change the duration of the piece by over a minute. So the duration is possibly a framework within which we work, but that doesn't necessarily dictate the speed. So at the beginning of this movement, Mahler says sehr langsam, so very slowly. End of the second bar, molto rit, so a lot of slowing down. And then in the third bar, a tempo, molto adagio. And he underlines the word molto, very slow. A tempo, molto adagio. Once this gets going, though, there are a number of indications as we go from section to section that things should move forward in tempo. So in the 10th bar, he marks nicht schleppen, don't schlepp. He said somewhat more flowing than the beginning. Again, later, drangend, fließen, these are all German terms for either driving or flowing. Figure 2, fließender, more flowing. Again, etwas drangend, somewhat pushing ahead. You get to the middle section, fließend. So again, the duration of the movement and the speed of the opening don't have that much to do with each other, depending on how successful you are at moving the performance forward bit by bit. One thing that we do know from research of early 20th century recorded performances is that in general, in earlier generations, say prior to World War II, prior to the early 1950s, performances tended to fluctuate more in tempo than they did later on. And in particular, they often started a little slower and got to a faster tempo in the middle. So in Mahler's generation, in the immediate post-Mahler generation of conductors, the general tendency is that as a performance develops, the tempo moves forward. So some of what Mahler is saying with these tempo markings may even just be a reinforcement of that existing performance tradition, that you start broadly, but then get it going as it develops. And without the benefit of metronome markings, how fast it should get in the middle is open to debate. But for me, I try to get it really moving in the middle. But I can't abide people who, not the people, I can't abide the idea of playing the opening of this as if it's a pop song, sort of fast and light and frivolous. And yes, I'm aware it was a love letter to his wife, and it's not funereal, of course. There's no debate there. But in this case, I think you have to focus on what's actually in the piece, and rather that than the reportage about past performances. So at the risk of being the guy in the glass house throwing stones, I'll just say that the most often cited examples of a faster tempo somehow coming from Mahler at the opening are Mengelberg and Bruno Walter. And Bruno Walter in particular was a great musician and a wonderful conductor, but he did not have a strong sense of slow pulse in his conducting. And so throughout his recorded output, things that involve, say, cross rhythms in a slow pulse, he really struggles with and tends to rush. It's consistent in his Brahms and in his Mahler. So things like the first and last movements of his famous recording of Das Lied von der Erde, he has a lot of trouble with. The Scherzo of this symphony, his recording is very sloppy and lacks rhythmic structure because he's trying to do it in one beat per bar, but he doesn't have the solidity. But this is not just a Mahler thing. This is not sort of, in my view, divinely handed down from Mahler to him that this is what Mahler had in mind, because you see the same problems happen in his Brahms recordings as well, that things like Brahms' Third Symphony with dee dum dum da dee da, he really struggles with those hemiolas going against this slow 6/4 beat, and he certainly does here at the opening of the Adagietto in his early recording. It feels like he's having a hard time gauging the triplets in the harp against the duples in the violin. And look, we're all human. We all have our limitations as musicians. But I don't think it's right to rate the importance of a historic recording over the importance of the final text from the composer. If there was just one indication of a slow tempo at the opening, then fine. But in this case, there's three in the first three bars, yeah? Sehr langsam, very slowly, molto rit, a tempo, molto adagio. So, two languages, three reiterations. It shouldn't start that fast, but it should develop in tempo. Now, I'm supposed to be telling you what the technical challenges are for the conductor, and here they are. In this opening, the slower you conduct it, the more difficult it is to align the harp and the strings. And this very issue that I mentioned with Dr. Walter of trying to have security of pulse when the subdivision of the pulse is changing from twos to threes, or when threes and twos are happening simultaneously, can be a real challenge. So in the beginning, we have a note in the violas. The lower part of the violas come in the middle of the bar, and the harp comes in with duple eighth notes right after that. Now, this has only one particular challenge, but this is a challenge through the whole movement, which is that in this kind of very delicate pianissimo playing, the nature of a string instrument is to want to take its time to speak. And you don't want to insist too much as a conductor, because you get a little bump in the sound instead of letting the players feel completely at ease to start when the moment feels right as a section. So I'm not going start now, but the harpist has to understand that this is going to happen, because if they're going just by my hand, it's very easy for them to start playing their offbeat before the violas have played their onbeat. Because the harp, by its nature, is just like a piano in that the sound speaks immediately. So you got the viola speaking in a very leisurely way and the harp speaking very promptly. So the harp has to really play with their ear, listen for the change, listen for the entry, and then move. And then in the second bar, the harp changes from duple eighth notes to triple eighth notes. And again, this is one of these things that gives some conductors a bit of trouble, understandably so. And the slower you are, the more difficult it is to gauge that change. Cellos come in on the second beat of the bar. And then the third and fourth beats of the bar are where we have this molto rit. The first violins come in on what we call the and of three, and four, and, while the harp finishes their molto rit in triplets. So we've had this challenge of going back and forth between a 2 and a 3, and now we have the challenge of aligning a 2 and a 3 at the same time while doing a molto rit. And again, the more molto that rit is, the more difficult it is. And here you have to decide as a conductor, am I going to subdivide for the violins 3 and 4 and, or am I going to stay in 4 and lose some of that precision and control? It depends a little bit on your harpist, how secure they are, because if they don't know the first violin part and you start conducting in 8 and they're playing in 12, it can be quite confusing for them. If they know the orchestral part inside out, which they really should, then I think you'll have more control that way. And then the last challenge, so you have and 4 and, very important to approach the downbeat in a fluid motion and not stop at the end of that molto rit. Why? Because you need a fluidity of motion in order to establish the speed of the triplets in the harp in the third bar. So you have espressivo, pianissimo, crescendo, molto rit, all of that in the violins, crescendo in the harp. And you need to allow as much time as that needs to get to its full arrival point without stopping your hand, so that you can then show a subito pianissimo, which probably means if I start that rit in a sort of normal position, sort of sternum height, 3 and 4 and, the subito pianissimo on the downbeat will probably be way up here, because I don't want to come all the way back down to bass camp and give a big thwopping accent right on that subito pianissimo. But I do want to have that fluidity, that yam, ba, ba, be, that I'm in control there and in alignment with the harpist for the speed of the triplet. So now we come to the fifth movement, the opening of the fifth movement. And here, I think the opposite advice to what I've given for the previous two movements is apt, which is the attacca between the fourth and the fifth movements is both helpful to the players and essential for the music. So one mustn't let the tension die away after the last chord of the Adagietto. And it's important that you get things going in the fifth movement without undue faffing around, because the longer you wait, the more nervous your horn player is going to get. I mean, Mahler's expectations of the inner strength of his solo players must have been incredible. I mean, you think again and again, that he pushes the solo trumpet, solo horn to extremes of dynamics and intensity, and then has them play things that are very exposed, very soft, very gentle. So here your horn player has just played this basic, 17-minute horn concerto in this third movement, then not played it all for the fourth movement. So probably by that point, their mouth is just starting to go kind of paralytic with lactic acid after this combination of exertion and stagnation in between. And really all you can do is encourage them not to think too hard about it. As with the opening, I think also you want to have some control as a conductor without being controlling, if that makes sense. So just as with the trumpet playing at the beginning, if I sort of look at my horn player and go, now, that's adding pressure to them. But I can have just as much or nearly as much control by suggesting to them, now. So it has to do with the shape of the hand, the invitation to play, as opposed to the instruction to play. So after this very, very, very long final chord of the Adagietto, and something about that release, I can do it in such a way that I don't have to show the arrival. I show the preparation, and we're agreed. So long chord, B. And I can be as insistent or vague as I need to be. But basically, I just want to invite her to play and then invite the strings to answer. Now, the opening of this is really fascinating. Mahler doesn't mark any tempo marking in the first two bars. I can't think of many pieces in music of this period where a composer as specific in his expectations as Mahler is, doesn't actually give you a tempo marking. But I try to take him at his word that within the bounds of how much endurance your horn player has left and how much control your violins have, this should feel free from the burden of tempo, but have a theatrical tempo of sensing when's the right moment for this, when's the right moment for that. Then allegro, be bum be ya ba da 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 ba be ba da da. And that melody in the bassoon is a quote from one of Mahler's songs called In Praise of Lofty Intellect. It's a very, very funny song about a donkey, aka an ass, judging a singing competition between a cuckoo and a nightingale. And that's going to dominate this whole last movement, this idea of an idiot judging a master, so to speak. At the end of that bassoon lick, the oboe enters, and again, there's an immediate tempo change. Mahler says hesitatingly for the oboe. Then allegro again for the bassoon, another rit and fermata, a tempo, etwas langsamer, a little slower for the clarinet. Now, is that a little slower than the horn the bar before, or a little slower than the oboe, who has similar material earlier? I think that's a decision the conductors got to make for themselves. Yeah. And then ritenuto just before the allegro starts. So that means held back as opposed to a ritardando, which is holding back. So immediately a little slower, and then allegro giocoso, fresh, into this very, very lively, funny, sophisticated, occasionally sarcastic, but ultimately amazingly life-affirming finale. So hope that all makes sense. And yeah, just remember, if you get a chance to conduct a Mahler symphony, do it.